Around 1250 BC, Egypt was living through what many consider the peak of its civilization, an empire that stretched from the Nile Delta to the depths of Nubia, ruled by a single man who had reigned for over 3 decades and who was already seen in his own lifetime not merely as pharaoh, but as a god among men. Ramesses II, the Great, had transformed Egypt into a military, diplomatic and architectural power without precedent. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic paintings, ancient maps, and engravings to life, shifting perspectives, changing camera angles, and moving through these scenes in ways their original creators could never have imagined. The goal isn't just to look at the past, but to step into it, to walk through Egypt as it once was, and imagine what it might have felt like to stand here on the banks of the Nile at the highest point of a civilization that lasted 3,000 years. And if you stick around until the end, we'll compare these same locations to how they look today, to see what time has changed and what still remains. Before we set foot in the Egypt of Ramesses, it helps to understand how this moment fits into the long arc of this civilization. By this time, Egypt already had nearly 2,000 years of continuous history behind it. The Great Pyramids at Giza had been built more than 1,300 years earlier, belonging to a past as distant for Ramesses as the fall of Rome is for us. The New Kingdom, the period we find ourselves in, had begun roughly 300 years before, when the Theban pharaohs drove the Hyksos invaders out of the delta and reunified the country. Since then, Egypt had expanded militarily, conquering territories in the Levant, in Syria, and deep into Nubia, accumulating unimaginable wealth that was channeled into temples, palaces, and monuments on a scale never before attempted. This was the age of the great builders, and no pharaoh built as much in as many places as Ramesses II. The scene we see here shows Pi-Ramesses, the new capital that Ramesses II ordered built in the eastern Nile Delta. The pharaoh had moved the center of power from Thebes in the south to this entirely new city, closer to the borders with Asia and the trade routes of the Mediterranean. The reasons were both strategic and personal, as Ramesses had grown up in this region and his family originally came from the delta. Pi-Ramesses was, in its time, one of the largest cities in the ancient world, with a population estimated at over 300,000 people spread across an area of nearly 20 square kilometers. Wide avenues lined with sphinxes led to temples dedicated to the great gods of Egypt, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth, while palaces with gilded floors and manicured gardens reflected the ambition of a pharaoh who wanted his city to surpass everything that came before. But Pi-Ramesses was not just ceremonial grandeur, it was also a war machine. Enormous bronze smelting factories operated on its outskirts, where workers forged shields and swords in high-temperature furnaces fed by bellows. The largest stable complex ever discovered in the ancient world was located here, capable of housing hundreds of horses for the royal army's chariots. Charioteers trained in the fields around the city, and specialized workshops repaired and built war chariots at a pace that only an imperial power could sustain. If Pi-Ramesses was the political and military heart of Egypt, Thebes, roughly 800 kilometers to the south along the Nile, remained its spiritual heart. Known to the Egyptians as Wasit, the city of the scepter, Thebes stretched across both banks of the river, covering an area of over 90 square kilometers. The eastern bank housed the city of the living, with its bustling markets, noble residences surrounded by gardens, artisan workshops, and above all, the 2 largest temple complexes in the ancient world. The western bank, in turn, belonged to the dead, a vast necropolis of mortuary temples and royal tombs carved into the limestone cliffs where the sun disappeared every evening, a symbolism that was anything but accidental. Even after Ramesses moved the capital north, Thebes remained the place where divine power was renewed. where the most important festivals on the Egyptian calendar took place, and where the pharaohs continued to be buried. At its height, the city sheltered a considerable population, and in its crowded streets, foreign merchants from the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, and East Africa mingled with Egyptian priests, scribes, soldiers, and craftsmen. This is the great Temple of Karnak, the largest religious complex in the ancient world, and the center of worship of Amun-Ra, king of the gods. The Egyptians called Idib-Petisut, the most venerated of places. Construction at Karnak had begun nearly 1,000 years before the time of Ramesses during the Middle Kingdom, and more than 30 different pharaohs had contributed to its continuous expansion, each one trying to outdo those who came before. But it is the great hypostyle hall that best defines the ambition of this place. Imagine stepping into a covered space of 5,000 square meters, supported by 134 giant sandstone columns shaped like papyrus stalks, arranged in 16 rows. The 12 central columns rise to over 20 meters in height, crowned by enormous open papyrus blossom capitals wide enough for 100 men to stand on each one. The father of Ramesses, Seti I, had begun this hall and decorated the northern wing with exquisite bas-relief carvings of extraordinary delicacy. Ramesses completed the rest, but in a different style, using sunk relief, faster to execute and more resistant to erosion. He covered every available surface with his royal cartouches, scenes of his military campaigns, and depictions of daily temple rituals. Sunlight entered through clerestory windows at the top, filtering between the columns and creating the effect of a petrified forest where gods and pharaohs seemed to dwell in permanence. On the exterior walls, the battles of Seti are carved on the north side, and those of Ramesses on the south, including the text of the peace treaty with the Hittites, one of the oldest diplomatic agreements in recorded history. Heading south along the eastern bank of the Nile, we reach the Temple of Luxor, which the Egyptians called Epet Resit, the southern sanctuary. Unlike Karnak, which served as the permanent residence of Amun-Ra, the Temple of Luxor existed for a specific purpose deeply tied to the very essence of pharaonic power, the renewal of the life force of kingship. Once a year, during the season of the Nile flood, the Opet festival was held here, the most important event on the Egyptian calendar. Shaven-headed priests removed the cult statue of Amun-Ra from the innermost sanctum of Karnak, bathed it, dressed it in colorful linen, and adorned it with jewelry of gold, silver, and lapis lazuli taken from the temple treasury. The image was then placed in a portable shrine atop a ceremonial bark and carried on the shoulders of priests to the Nile, where it was loaded onto a special vessel called Yuzahat Amun. The procession stretched nearly 3 kilometers between Karnak and Luxor. Musicians played harps, flutes, and drums. Nubian and Libyan dancers performed rhythmic movements. Soldiers in formation marched along the riverbanks with chariots and horses adorned with colorful plumes. And crowds of ordinary people watched from the water's edge, celebrating with bread and beer distributed by the temple. In the time of Ramesses, this festival lasted 27 days. It was perhaps the only moment of the year when common people could draw close to the divine and feel that they were part of the sacred cycle that kept Egypt in balance. Ramesses added to the Temple of Luxor a great peristyle courtyard with colossal seated statues of himself, representing not the mortal man, but the royal Ka, the eternal life force of Egyptian kingship. It was here, during the Opet, that ordinary citizens were admitted for the first time into the sacred precinct, an extraordinarily rare privilege that transformed the temple for a few days into a meeting point between the human world and the world of the gods. Connecting Karnak and Luxor was the Avenue of Sphinxes, a processional way of nearly 3 kilometers lined with hundreds, of ram-headed statues, the sacred animal of Amun, creating a monumental corridor between the two temples. Imagine walking along that avenue at dusk, with the golden light of the sun bathing the rows of sphinxes on either side, the distant sound of priestly hymns, and in the background, the pylons of Luxor rising against the reddening sky. Crossing the Nile to the western bank, we enter the territory of the dead. It is here that we find the Valley of the Kings, an arid and remote gorge hidden among the Theban cliffs where the pharaohs of the New Kingdom chose to be buried far from the eyes of the world. The choice of this location was no accident. After centuries of pyramid and mastaba plundering, the pharaohs had decided to abandon visible monuments in favor of hidden burials, carved deep into the limestone. The tombs were true underground works of art, with corridors extending tens of meters into the heart of the mountain. Their walls completely covered with scenes from the Book of the Dead, the Book of Gates, and other funerary compositions that guided the pharaoh's soul on its journey through the underworld, through the 12 hours of the night until rebirth with the morning sun. By the time of Ramesses, the valley already held dozens of royal burials, and the pharaoh himself had ordered his own tomb prepared here. The entrance to the valley was permanently guarded by the Medjay police, who controlled all access and patrolled the area day and night to prevent any attempt at robbery. A short walk from the Valley of the Kings lay the village of Deir el-Medina, known in ancient times as Set Mat, the place of truth. This was the planned community where the artisans responsible for carving and decorating the royal tombs lived, the so-called servants in the place of truth. They were not slaves, as was long believed, but highly skilled and respected workers, stonemasons, sculptors, painters, carpenters, draftsmen and scribes, who passed their trades from father to son across generations. The village had roughly 70 houses within a protective wall, laid out in a rectangular grid pattern, with a narrow path running its full length. The men worked in shifts of 10 days, organized into 2 teams, sleeping in temporary shelters above the valley and returning to the village for rest days, religious festivals, and family celebrations. They received their pay in rations of grain, beer, and other essential goods delivered monthly from Thebes. The village was isolated and had no water supply of its own. Everything had to be carried daily from the river. The thousands of limestone fragments and papyrus scraps found here have revealed extraordinary details about legal disputes, love poems, medical prescriptions, work absence records, and even letters exchanged between workers containing spells against scorpion stings. On the western bank of Thebes also stands the Ramesseum, the mortuary temple of Ramesses II, a vast complex that the Egyptians called the House of Millions of Years, dedicated to the pharaoh's eternal memory and to his cult after death. The temple followed the traditional plan, with monumental pylons at the entrance, 2 large open courtyards, a hypostyle hall, and an inner sanctuary. But the scale was immense. At the entrance stood a colossal seated statue of Ramesses carved from a single block of granite. The walls were covered with reliefs of the pharaoh's military campaigns, with particular emphasis on the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, fought in the 5th year of his reign, which Ramesses celebrated obsessively across virtually all of his monuments as a great victory, even though the Hittite records tell a different story. Around the temple, mud brick storerooms with barrel-vaulted ceilings held the resources needed for ongoing worship, and these structures represent some of the oldest examples of true arches still standing in Egypt. If I could stand in a single place to understand the scale of Ramesses' ambition, it would probably be Abu Simbel, at the far southern edge of his empire, deep in Nubia. Here, on the frontier of the Egyptian world, Ramesses ordered 2 temples carved directly into the face of a cliff on the banks of the Nile. The larger temple features 4 colossal seated statues of the pharaoh, each roughly 20 meters tall, flanking the entrance cut into the rock. The interior follows a telescoping plan with progressively smaller chambers along a central axis that penetrates nearly 60 meters into the mountain, culminating in a sanctuary where 4 statues of deities, including the deified Rameses himself, sit side by side on a stone bench. The temple was positioned with extraordinary astronomical precision, so that twice a year, in February and October, dates believed to correspond to the pharaoh's birthday and coronation, the first rays of the rising sun penetrate the full length of the temple and illuminate 3 of the 4 statues in the deepest sanctuary. For any traveler arriving in Nubia from the south, the 4 seated figures on the riverbank were an unmistakable message of power. Beside the larger temple, a smaller one was dedicated to the goddess Hathor and to Queen Nefertari. The fact that Rameses dedicated an entire temple to a queen was extraordinarily rare and reflected Nefertari's importance in the ceremonial life of the kingdom. The Nile was the axis around which this entire civilization revolved. Without the river, none of this would have existed. Every year, between July and October, the annual floods deposited a layer of fertile silt on the farmland bordering its banks, renewing the soil and enabling abundant harvests that fed the entire population. The rhythm of the floods defined the calendar, the religious festivals, and the organization of labor. Boats of every size sailed constantly between cities, carrying grain, building stone, gold from Nubia, cedar wood from Lebanon, and luxury goods from across the eastern Mediterranean. For the Egyptians, the Nile was not merely a resource, it was a divine manifestation, personified by the god Hapi, whose generosity determined the difference between abundance and famine. Knowing what we know now, it is strange to think how natural and permanent all of this must have seemed to those who lived here. The Egypt of Rameses was at the peak of its power, but within a few generations, the sea peoples would attack the Mediterranean coasts, the mines would produce less, officials would grow corrupt, and the priests of Amun in Thebes would accumulate so much power that they would govern the south almost independently. The workers of Deir el-Medina would stage the first recorded strike in history. But in 1250 BC, none of this was visible. For anyone walking through Thebes or passing beneath the giant columns of Karnak, Egypt seemed eternal. Now, I want to bring you into the present and show how these places look today. Thanks for being here, and if you have thoughts or requests for future cities, share them in the comments. Let's get into it. Pi-Rameses has all but vanished. When the branch of the Nile that fed it changed course, the city was abandoned and its monuments dismantled and carried off to Tanis. Today, the village of Kantir sits on the site, and only excavations have revealed the extent of what once lay beneath the farmland. Karnak has survived as one of the greatest ruins in the ancient world. The great hypostyle hall still stands, though the roof has long since disappeared. The giant columns continue to rise against the sky, and traces of original paint can still be seen on the underside of some capitals, a reminder that what we see today as bare stone was once an explosion of color. The Temple of Luxor remains at the heart of the modern city, illuminated at night in a way its builders could never have imagined. The avenue of sphinxes connecting the 2 temples has been rediscovered and partially restored, and today it is possible to walk along part of this processional way that for centuries lay buried beneath the city. The Valley of the Kings continues to yield secrets. Dozens of tombs are open to the public, and the paintings on their walls retain much of their original color, preserved by the dry desert climate. Deir el-Medina remains one of the most revealing archaeological sites in Egypt. The foundations of the houses, the decorated tombs of the artisans, and the thousands of written fragments have turned this place into an unparalleled window into the daily life of ancient Egypt. Abu Simbel is no longer in its original location. When the Aswan Dam in the 1960s threatened to submerge the temples, an unprecedented international operation dismantled both monuments block by block and rebuilt them on an artificial hill higher up and further west. The four colossal statues of Rameses still gaze out over the river, but now above a lake that covers the spot where they stood for more than 3,000 years. The Ramesseum lies partly in ruins. The colossal statue toppled centuries ago and lies fragmented on the temple floor, and it was this image that inspired the poet Shelley to write Ozymandias, perhaps the most famous poem ever written about the passage of time and the vanity of human power. I do really appreciate you watching. Your ideas, input, and constructive feedback really do shape what comes next. Feel free to leave a comment below. Until next time.